Hi, you're watching South Asia Matters on AwaazSouth Asia. I'm Nirupama Subramanian, and my guest today is Dr. Avinash Paliwal, who teaches at the SOAS in London. He teaches in the Department of Politics, and we're today going to discuss the visit of External Affairs Minister of India, S. Jaishankar, to the UK. Welcome to the show, Dr. Paliwal. Good to have you. So let me start by asking you about Mr. Jaishankar's visit. You know, the optics were very good. The two, Mr. Jaishankar and his wife, and Mr. Prime Minister Sunak and his wife, they were photographed sitting together. The women were dressed in saris, so good optics. Also, the day before, I think, or a couple of days before Mr. Jaishankar's visit, the UK also declared India as a safe country, which means that they'll not be offering asylum to illegal immigrants, which is, I think, what India has wanted. So there were these nice optics, but what is your assessment of that visit?
Thank you for having me here, Nirupama. Thank you for the question. It has been a successful visit. I think from Indian perspective, this has been a visit both high on optics and perhaps even high on substance, at least from Indian perspective, right? The fact that when External Affairs Minister Jaishankar landed here and there has been a cabinet reshuffle was something that actually stymied some of the aspects of for the British side rather than for the Indian side. And I believe it has actually strengthened the Indian negotiating position vis-a-vis United Kingdom on something as central in this bilateral as at this point in time as the free trade agreement. But also generally, I think there is an emergence of a bipartisan consensus. The Conservative Party has always been quite pro-India, but even the Labour under the new leadership of Sir Kier Starmer has very clearly indicated that they would prefer continuity of or continuing this momentum that the two countries have built around a variety of strategic issues. Now, I think what we do get a sense of as far as this particular visit goes, I mean, first of all, it was long awaited, so it's good that it did happen. It has, perhaps arrested some of the aspects of the risks that would have been associated of having this relationship kind of slide down in the priority ladder or in the pecking order of priorities.
And it has come after. Sorry to interrupt, but it has come after some acrimonious exchanges over the last 6 months. Over the Khalistan issue as well. So, as you were saying, yeah.
Yes, so whether it's Khalistan issue, whether there's been a lot of variety of friction points between this bilateral historically as well, right? Especially when Labour government was in power, the issue of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir was never something that London and Delhi kind of really looked eye to eye at. I think this was a visit to kind of reset ties or to push ties in a certain direction, a certain positive direction. And I do believe that the External Affairs Minister has succeeded on that count. I do think that there is a desire from the Indian side to conclude the free trade agreement sooner than later. And I do think partly the ball on this count is in the British court rather than in the Indian court. So I think that is something that we need to see. There was, from what I understand, there's been very clear signaling that has happened to UK that India is committed to this, but there are certain concerns that India has around this agreement, which the UK will have to address on a reciprocal basis. Right? Both sides have their concerns. So I do hope that there would be some degree of clarity on that particular aspect moving forward, which would hopefully kind of reduce the salience of issues such as Khalistan and other irritants which exist in this relationship.
So how important is it for both sides to actually conclude this agreement in the next few months before the elections in the UK? Is that a consideration? Because the government changes, maybe the chemistry changes.
That is certainly a risk, and that is perhaps one reason why over the past few months we have seen a concerted drive by Indian diplomats, and this time even by Dr. Jaishankar, to really kind of reach out to the Labour leadership. There is a very systematic attempt to make sure that the new incoming Labour leadership is aware of India and its priorities in the Indo-Pacific, is aware of the stakes at play, and is also perhaps being prepared to ensure that there is continuity on certain bilateral issues of strategic significance, including the free trade agreement, but also diaspora politics, because that could be one aspect with the Labour government, the Khalistan issue, the salience of which could increase. So I think there has been attempts. Yes, there is no doubt to my mind that both India and the United Kingdom, for a variety of different reasons, there are elections coming in India as well, would like to see this through before at least March or April 2024, because then India can also kind of say that this is one of our first free trade agreement with a Western country. I think more than the substance of this free trade agreement for the Indian economy, it's the prestige associated with this particular agreement from the Indian perspective. For UK, there is a much more powerful economic logic to have this agreement, especially in light of the changes that this economy has seen here post-Brexit. So I think there are different logics at play, but yeah, the temporality of this whole process has been, it's better suited to conclude it sooner than later. And the UK British politics hasn't helped on that count, and the instability that we have seen in London, that has not helped. And I do fear that the story of infighting within the government, the Conservative government, I don't think that has ended. I do think before Christmas or just after there's a risk of another no confidence motion against Rishi Sunak, which would be triggered by the sacked former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, and what that entails is something that we need to, that will have consequences in terms of at least the process of this negotiation. If not, it won't kind of, dislocate this conversation, but it would delay it certainly.
So Mr. Jaishankar actually landed in the middle of that process of the changes in the cabinet, of the dismissal of Suella Braverman. But she has, hit back by saying that Rishi Sunak is a coward, and that, he's driving the Tories to another defeat. So what do you make of that, really? I mean, is that going to be a continuing trope for the Tories? And how is this whole, the Israel war in Gaza playing out in British politics? Because even the Labour leader, Kier Starmer, is facing a huge rebellion in his party about his own stand. So it seems to have an all-round effect, the Israel invasion of Gaza.
Before I come to the issue of Israel and and its invasion of Gaza, which is really kind of cut through the heart of British body politic, but not just Britain, even in the United States, it has had quite a lot of resonance. Let me first address your first question about the Suella Braverman affair, and what does this mean? And the resignation letter is very strong. It's full of intent, political intent, and I think there's one thing which we have seen happen over the past, especially since I would actually go back to the Scottish referendum of 2014, and the post-Scottish referendum overconfidence that David Cameron displayed into agreeing to a referendum on Brexit, and the cascading decline of the Tory party into internal civil war within the party, right? They did win the 2019 general election very handsomely, but that was again a reflection of civil war within the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. What we have seen is that the instability that Brexit has caused in this country, and the instability that the post-2008-2009 economic recession has caused, the economic stress that it has caused, has really empowered some of the very far right fringe elements within the Conservative Party, right? This whole idea of stopping the boats, this whole anti-migrant politics, very kind of virulent in its practice, typified by individuals like Suella Braverman, but not just, that they have become increasingly empowered. And over the past year or so, we have seen they have been part of the government. And only when they were part of the government did the prime minister of the time, in this case, Rishi Sunak, they realized the costs of having ideologues, such staunch ideologues, in positions of power in what is ultimately conservative but not a radical society, a society which is not willing to accept radicalism or extremes of any kind, right or left. And that is what led to the rise of Suella Braverman and all the eventual sacking that Rishi Sunak wants to bring the politics back to the center right at least. I don't think Suella Braverman will go down easy. She will not sit back. There's a very live risk that she will mobilize opinion both within the parliamentarians within the Conservative Party, but also the body politic broadly, to shape a coalition to press through a no confidence motion. If that happens, and again, the grapevine here says that this could happen as early as Christmas, which is basically a month from now, could happen shortly after. But if that happens, and if Rishi Sunak perchance does lose that vote, we will be looking at expedited national elections, or at least that's what should happen. You can always see another kind of internal fight for the next prime minister from within the Conservative Party, but the candidates, there aren't really any candidates left at this point in time to take charge. So there's a possibility of early national election in this country. Now, this broader politics has kind of dovetailed into what we see the global polarization around the Israel and Gaza war, right? There is a very powerful history of anti-Semitism in Europe. The issue of creation of Israel and 1948 and the Palestinian cause it cuts deeply into the political consciousness of Western society and is not just a diasporic issue that the Arab diaspora is being mobilized or the Israeli or the Jewish diaspora. Now, that is always the case, but this is much deeper. It is an identity issue for West in itself in some fundamental way. And we can see the polarization around that. We can see the deeply felt anger that many people felt by what Hamas did on October the 7th. And then we can also see the deep sort of, pockets of anger and resentment against how Israel responded. And that's a very strong response. And the humanitarian crisis is staggering in Gaza, and no one can dispute that, right? And that has really kind of pitched the constituents and the constituencies led by both Conservative Party parliamentarians and Labour Party parliamentarians, but definitely more Labour, because they represent that idea of a bit more liberal, a bit more kind of humanitarian cause. They really are finding it difficult to navigate the politics on the ground with the larger strategic questions that govern policy responses around something as polarizing in a geopolitical global sense as Israel's invasion of Gaza, right? In the Russian case of aggression in Ukraine, there was near clear consensus of how the West had to respond, and they did respond on that. But with Israel, it has really split the West, and the question of principle, the question of if you call Russians doing a genocide or creating a crisis, humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, you have to criticize your allies as much as your adversaries in this case. And we can see that it has split, at least to a considerable extent, the Labour Party, but also the Conservatives. The vote that was initiated by the SNP leader Hamza Yusuf in the parliament yesterday has really clarified the kind of dichotomies that parliamentarians face in their day-to-day lives. And one of the senior frontbencher of Labour, Jess Phillips, voted against it. Voted for the motion, which means she voted for ceasefire, and that most likely means she'll lose her shadow front bench. The shadow, I think she was working in the shadow Home Office. She will lose that position, as Kier Starmer had kind of clarified before the vote happened. So we see all these processes kind of really interacting with each other and creating a lot of churn in British society and British politics.
So you spoke about how it has polarized and polarized opinion and divided constituents and so on. And we saw a huge demonstration in London the last weekend, and they've been having these demonstrations every weekend since this whole issue began. And Suella Braverman lost her job in the cabinet because she criticized these marches. She criticized the London Metropolitan Police for not cracking down on these marches and calling these protesters hate marchers, and saying that the London police was actually playing favorites. But on the other hand, people have also been saying that Suella Braverman was becoming too much of an embarrassment and she had to go anyway. High time she was sacked. But it took the happenings in Gaza for Rishi Sunak to sack her. So it means that that war is really impacting how, as you said, how the British government is thinking about its response, and probably speaks also of the pressure from the ground, from these marches every weekend, and maybe to make a policy shift in the way in their response so far.
I think, okay, I'll take the second aspect first in this case. I don't think that the protests that we are seeing play out, the pro-Palestinian protests at least, they will lead to a policy shift. I think the parliament has very clearly spoken. The exercise of SNP introducing a motion in favor of ceasefire has been rejected broadly. There have been many supporters, but predominantly both the Conservatives and Labour have voted against that motion. So I think that is as clear a mandate as any government could get in terms of policy kind of fulcrum where it lies. So I think do not expect any radical changes in British policy towards Israel or European policy. I mean, you have the German Chancellor coming and saying the charges being made against Israel are kind of baseless. It is a democracy who we will support. Some really kind of strong statements, somewhat disconnected to the ground situation, but deeply connected to the global geopolitical scenario, right? I would be cautious to associate or kind of ascribe causality to Braverman's removal with the tumult that has caused, this war has caused in British politics. Certainly the response, Braverman's kind of criticism of the police, Braverman's, I mean, kind of branding of these protests as hate marches, that did not help. The polarization around the world did not help her cause as she expected it to, because she was trying to mobilize people against these marches, and she did have support among a lot of conservative bodies. I think what really caused this decision was the cascading negativity that she was piling up in her favor, unfortunately for her, over the last 1 year. See, this is a Home Secretary which had a very partisan agenda, too partisan for British public life. Let's put it like that, right? Yes, people in UK would like to see a government that is competent and in control of the borders, but what was happening here was not, it was of a different caliber, the kind of advocacy. We were seeing, refugees dying in the Channel, sinking in the boats that they were coming in, and there is a humanitarian element to British politics which has not been lost. And I think she was completely disconnected to some basic semblance of humility in that sense. She did not focus at all on the cost of living crisis and how to kind of abate it. She left it with Sunak to kind of deal with it. But there was no, people felt that this is a woman, she's on a mission rather than on actually to focus on good governance. And I think that did kind of create a lot of unpopularity for her in a wider base, at least, if not in the core areas, core constituencies where she still commands support. And it was that cascade coupled with what happened around Gaza that really tilted the balance for Sunak to kind of get rid of her. To keep her in government was becoming much more costly in a political sense than to sack her. Every second round of PMQs, Prime Minister's questions, the opposition really took the Prime Minister to town on being weak for not being able to handle a Home Secretary, which was considered, being called colloquially in slang Cruella, instead of so really cruel policies being meted out, or saying that being homeless is a lifestyle choice. That will never go down well in British society. That just doesn't happen. So I think that is where the real cause of this shift is, the Gaza issue and the kind of miscalculation on Braverman's part to kind of take on the police, which is considered to be a very respectable institution, broadly put. Yes, there are excesses that it has done, but it's not, I mean, the position of police in British society is not what we see in the United States, where it is a very different, very kind of, extreme sort of policing with guns. Here, guns are not, they don't carry guns unless there's an emergency. So community policing is still respected, and people did not like the fact that, hey, this Home Secretary going against an institution. And the fact that the police commissioner stood up and actually maintained institutional integrity and professionalism in the face of such partisan onslaught by his own boss, in this sense, really has it has instilled more faith among people in British policing in some ways. These protests were not hate marches. Yes, there were elements of, they probably were people who support Hamas and would like to see some sort of dislocation by meting out violence in such wide protest. But the broad sense was very clear. This is people coming out on the street expressing themselves. And this is a British tradition that goes long back and is not restricted to this event. We have seen a lot of protests, very peaceful protests. So there was no good reason for the police to kind of intervene in that sense.
And the police chief actually defended the people's right to protest. He said, yes, there has been some violence, but not enough to justify us banning these protests, which is actually exactly the opposite of what's been happening in India, the world's largest democracy, where people have been protesting against Israeli actions in a few places. I mean, the largest of those marches, of those protests, was in Kerala, but we haven't really seen any big processions or protests, and even the small ones have been disrupted. People have been called in by the police. The protesters themselves have been branded as terrorists or supporters of terrorism. So how do you see this difference between how civil society in Britain and civil society in India has responded to Gaza? I mean, it's really there's quite a gap, I think, in the way it has turned out.
See, firstly, I would qualify that the war is much more personally felt by people in Britain than people in India, right? The Israel-Palestine issue is not that distant to the British public as perhaps it is to the Indian public, right? If something would happen, let's say in Kashmir, of course, Indians would really kind of stand up, and there would be much more mobilization or anything.
And yet, no, there are people who feel very strongly for Israel. There are people who are ready to go and fight for Israel.
Yes, yes. So that's exactly you're absolutely right. Look, Indian society has also changed. Indian politics has gone in a fundamentally the politics of India has gravitated towards the Hindu right. It is not just a top-down phenomenon; it's also a bottoms-up phenomenon, and that does make that does increase the kind of demographic pockets who actually support the Israeli cause quite strongly. And I mean, as you noted, there are people who want to fight, but I do know people, students and academics in the United Kingdom at SOAS here as well, who are telling us that people, let's say in Eastern UP, are very clearly going out. They don't really have any direct stake, but have very strong opinion, which is pro-Israel. So I think that's a reality. That's an Indian reality today. So I'm not surprised that there haven't been such big outpouring of criticism against Israel. And there's always been this Israel envy in Indian society, and not just in institutions, right? We should be like Israel. We'll be assertive. We should be strong. And today, after a long time, people feel at least that you have a government who's asserting itself, similar to how Israel asserts itself. And shortly after what happened in Canada, the Canadian allegations of alleged covert assassination by Indian intelligence, I mean, there is this pride also being felt by many in India that we are asserting ourselves as a global power. And Israel is a ready comparison in that sense. Correct or incorrect is a different matter. Helpful or otherwise is also a different matter, but that exists. So that is one thing. And yes, as you said, there is also a much more liberal policy of coercive policing against these protests. So that also changes the day-to-day calculus. If someone has to decide whether they want to go out on the street and protest, is this a battle you want to pick? And I wouldn't be surprised if most people believe that even if it's important to say something against Israel and its actions, you don't want to go out on the street and get arrested for that. Not in contemporary India, at least. So it's a accumulation of different factors, I would see. So I would be reluctant to compare India and British case in that sense. But yes, I mean, in UK we have seen the British police standing up to the Prime Minister and saying that we have no legal grounds. I mean, to my mind at least, that's a testament of institutional strength and resilience for modern United Kingdom. I still take heart as someone who's a resident of United Kingdom that the police, and the legal systems are strong enough to kind of push back against that very clear partisan tilt that was coming from the Home Secretary, previous Home Secretary. Not saying that the politics of the Tories will change anytime soon, but if they can promise some degree of integrity and calm for the next few months at least, that would be something that we would take.
So you mentioned how India is now assertive, or is perceived to be assertive in the world, and taking strong positions. And you mentioned the Canadian issue, which brings me right back to Mr. Jaishankar's visit to the UK, and he has made statements to the effect that he raised the Khalistan issue with the British, and he met the new Home Secretary, and he met the British National Security Advisor as well. And where are the two countries on this issue? There seems to be a gap in the perception, or there seemed to be a gap in the perception. Has that gap been closed now with this visit? Do you think there's been some progress on that issue?
No, I don't think there has been a fundamental bridging of perspectives on how United Kingdom's government views this kind of mobilization, how it will kind of tackle this kind of mobilization. But what has happened is that Indian pressure has ensured that the United Kingdom is much more sensitive towards Indian concerns. It will not go out of its way like Justin Trudeau in Canada to kind of make a point out of this to antagonize India. I think that is a very clear consensus emerging in London, that you don't want the costs accruing to that kind of an activist foreign policy towards India. But that does not translate into bridging of the gap and suddenly the United British government really coming and accepting the Indian narrative on Khalistan movements. Look, the way freedom of expression, the way political practices, the way mobilization and protest dynamics are explained and rationalized legally, politically, sociologically, uh, are just, I mean, that is different from how that plays out in India. And I do think if tomorrow there's another protest led by Khalistani elements, they will make sure Britain is much more sensitive, in the sense that today they still provide round the clock security to the High Commission. I can testify that. I saw that just yesterday. And they also, if there is a protest happening, they have very clearly signaled the Sikh community who protests that they need to give a clear forewarning. Any sort of adventurism that happened previously when the tricolour was brought down will not be tolerated. And I think that has allowed the two sides to kind of reduce the salience of that kind of an issue and not let that kind of spiral completely out of control, as it seemed to be the case when India kind of reacted strongly against the British High Commissioner in New Delhi, right? And they kind of removed some of the security and all that.
Yeah.
I think that degree of that intensity that existed in that relationship, the risk of spiraling it out, that has been contained, and I think that is successful. I do think the High Commissioner here has been very proactive in kind of messaging that, but also messaging some degree of calm, to instill some degree of calm in this relationship and to stabilize it. The High Commission has been very active on that front, and the Brits have responded to it positively as well. So let's see how this plays out. If the Labour government, I think there could be a different calculus at play, at least on the Khalistani issue. The Tories as a party, they don't really rely on the Sikh vote. Um, and I do think even if the Labour comes to power, they will be cautious against using that, translating that Sikh vote into foreign policy practice or foreign policy signaling with India. I don't think Kier Starmer would jeopardize the UK-India bilateral, because some constituents and some cabinet members happen to kind of rely on that vote. But I doubt that will happen in this case. So let's see.
It's interesting that you mentioned how the perceptions differ even on how free speech and freedom of expression plays out in both countries, because Mr. Jaishankar actually made a remark yesterday to the media as he was wrapping up his visit, that he did tell the British, his interlocutors in the British government, that uh, yeah, there's freedom of speech and expression even in India, but that the British government should guard against the misuse of this fundamental right to free speech and expression. Do you think going by the events between Suella Braverman and the police chief and the prime minister, and finally that march being allowed in the anti-Israel march being allowed. Do you think there is an audience for that kind of message in the British establishment today? That the message that of misuse of freedom of speech.
So I think the wrapping up event that he did. I mean, I was present. I was in the audience at the Wilton Park event, and I was able to kind of really hear him start to finish. I think his response was more in context of the Canadian issue and what he can communicated to the Canadians. I think he has been careful not to overblow or to kind of give too much primacy to the Khalistan irritant in this UK-India bilateral during his visit. And I do think that's deliberate and perhaps also healthy because you don't want to dislocate negotiations. I think that was in response to a question that Lionel Barber asked about Canada, Justin Trudeau, and him telling that, yes, this is what we conveyed to him in terms of differences on freedom of speech. I do think there is an increased appreciation in the United Kingdom. That's who I can talk about most confidently. That there is a case to be considered in terms of India's sensitivities on the Sikh issue and the Khalistani issue. And I think that appreciation is visible and is being understood. I mean, that is being communicated to the Indian counterparts as well, right, by the Brits. But I do not think that this kind of messaging from the Indian foreign minister will have any effect on how protests play out. At least peaceful protests play out. United Kingdom will not allow arms training and kind of, anything that takes this protest into the kinetic direction, which happened in the case of Niger in Canada. That is something that the United Kingdom will very proactively clamp down on the moment they get any evidence, the intelligence gets any evidence of that. But in terms of not allowing the community to exercise their right of free speech peacefully, I don't think anyone will accept clamp down on that. So I do not foresee that. So we should be very clear, moving forward, we should expect Khalistani protesters outside the Indian High Commission at Strand. But I do think that we should also expect the British government handling that much better moving forward than what we saw over the last 6 months. So in that sense, India has succeeded in its diplomacy of sending the point across. The allegations that came from Canada shook up a lot of Western governments in the Anglosphere. And I think they're taking note of making sure that they, at least from their side, do not provide the Indians an excuse for doing what they're alleging that it has done.
They were silent during that particular exchange between Canada and India, while the US did say something, but UK was silent. Let me just ask you one last question. We're talking about Indian concerns about Khalistanis, and you mentioned during the course of our discussion today diaspora politics, Indian diaspora politics in UK. So has the British side, are you aware of the British side has expressed any concern about how this politics plays out on British soil?
I do know that in 2019, and that was that's a very clear-cut case when there were credible kind of, there was mobilization of the Hindu Indian diaspora by the more kind of, right-leaning, Hindu right-leaning groups, diaspora groups with, links to the Hindu nationalist kind of ecosystem with its base in India. I do know that the British Foreign Office issued a protest note and they lobbied in favor of the Tory government, in favor of Boris Johnson, and they lobbied the Hindu diaspora against Jeremy Corbyn. And there was a protest note sent very silently, very subtly. I remember the Hindu reported it. That this is not acceptable, this is interference, but they also kept it under wraps because Boris Johnson did win the election, so he kind of made sure that it doesn't become an issue. There are concerns in London that what happened in Canada, whether correct or not, accurate or not, the allegations by Trudeau, that there is a risk of the state of India kind of mobilizing the diaspora and sharpening some of the diasporic fault lines as they exist between Indians and Pakistanis, or along religious lines as well, not just India-Pakistan lines, moving forward. And I think
there were the Leicester riots as well, right?
Leicester violence, yeah. And that is something that continues to simmer, Nirupama. That is something that the Brits are trying very hard not to let that come in the way of a larger strategic play that they have with the Indians in a global sense against China in the Indo-Pacific. But I do believe that if both sides don't kind of temper their expectations and temper their activism on this count, this is an issue that can really become much more than an irritant. It could become a big kind of, it could become a bone of contention. So I do hope that diplomacy prevails. I do hope that the conversations carry on, and I do hope that both sides know each other's red lines moving forward on these issues, because any kind of even perceived interference by India in domestic affairs of these countries, it's a sensitive issue. They see Chinese and other countries, Russians do that. They would not want to see India, if something starts happening on a routine basis, then India's reputation in a larger sense does come under risk. Right now, it's a very positive reputation as an ally, even if the politics of India has gravitated towards the right that has not bothered British public or British society in a fundamental sense, and they are okay with that till the time they leave it for the Indians to decide their politics, and which I think is fair. But if this translates into interference in British affairs, that could become an issue.
So on that note, thank you, Dr. Paliwal, for your time. Thank you all for watching South Asia Matters on AwaazSouth Asia. Please follow us on AwaazSouthAsia.com. Read our stories there, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you.